Hello everyone, my name is JJ, and today we are going to talk about Canadian premiers. Okay, so the big Canadian political news story last week was Doug Ford getting elected Premier of Ontario. It was a widely expected win, all things considered, and marked the first major inroad of this sort of Trump-style right-wing populism into Canada. As I have noted in some of my previous videos about the man, Doug Ford is this very unvarnished sort of character who is really prone to speaking bluntly and speaking from the gut, which makes him quite a contrast with the other sorts of men who usually wind up as premiers of Canadian provinces. And just who are these other men who have wound up running Canada's provinces? I get a lot of requests to make a video on this topic, so let's take a look. We'll go through all the premiers. There's only 10 of them, so it shouldn't take too long. So before I begin, not to be too condescending about this, but let me just bring you up to speed very quickly if you don't know anything about Canadian politics. So Canada is split up into 10 provinces. Every province has its own government, and the head of the government is the Prime Minister of the province, or the Premier as we now call them. Canada has a three-party political system. There is the Conservative Party, which is conservative, there is the Liberal Party, which is progressive, and there is the NDP, which is more progressive. Okay, so starting here in British Columbia, we have Premier John Horgan of the NDP. He came to power almost exactly 1 year ago and is the most popular Premier in Canada with an approval rating of over 52%. Approval ratings for Canadian politicians tend to be quite low because our politics is quite awful. Being a British Columbian myself, I must say I do notice that a lot of people seem to go out of their way to tell me how much they like Premier Horgan. He has this sort of friendly, happy dad personality and is considered to come from the moderate wing of his party, so he doesn't really come off like some far-left lunatic. But that being said, Horgan is very unpopular in other parts of Canada because his government is being very obstinate in opposing the construction of this big Alberta to BC oil pipeline. Basically, the entire Canadian establishment wants to see this pipeline built, but Horgan is like, no, we have enough pipelines and oil is bad for the environment. And this is actually becoming quite a large crisis in Canada at the moment, with Horgan really being painted as the villain of the picture. But the other interesting thing about Horgan is that he came to power in this very weird way. His party actually came in second place in last year's election, behind the first place Liberals. But Horgan was able to form an alliance with the tiny third place Green Party, which only has 3 seats, and become premier that way. This kind of coalition building parliamentary shenanigans is very rare in Canada. No premier had come to power this way in over 30 years. Moving one province east, we have Premier Rachel Notley of Alberta, who is also from the NDP. Notley is the only woman premier in Canada and was elected in 2015 in this big dramatic upset. Before Notley's election, Alberta had been run by the Conservative Party for 44 unbroken years, so this made her quite the hero to the Alberta left. But Alberta is still a very conservative place, and Notley is considered quite conservative by NDP standards. She is very supportive of her province's oil industry at a time when the broader Canadian left seems to be turning against oil pretty hard, which makes her a bit of an awkward figure who is not super beloved nationally. She is a big booster of that pipeline that Premier Horgan hates, which means she is not even a unifying figure within her own party. The conventional wisdom on her these days is that her victory was kind of this one-time fluke, a protest vote against a very stagnant Conservative Party, and that she will easily lose her bid for re-election next year. The Conservative Party will get back in Alberta, and equilibrium will be quickly restored. Now, next door to Alberta, we have Saskatchewan, which is ruled by Premier Scott Moe of the Saskatchewan Party. The Saskatchewan Party is this weird party that only exists in Saskatchewan, obviously. It is usually thought of as being a broadly conservative party, but officially it is a union of liberals and conservatives who are united in their hatred of the NDP. Premier Moe hasn't been in office very long. He inherited the job in February of this year after the old Premier of Saskatchewan, Brad Wall, retired. The big thing about Premier Wall was that he really hated Prime Minister Trudeau and opposed everything that he did, which made him this big folk hero on the Canadian right. So as the months go on, there will be a lot of pressure on Premier Moe to continue that legacy. East of him, we have Brian Pallister, the Conservative Premier of Manitoba. Pallister was elected in 2016, the first Conservative Premier of Manitoba after 17 years of NDP rule. I do not know that much about him, and I don't think most Canadians do either. Manitoba is the most easily ignored major province of Canada and does not tend to exert much influence on national politics. Pallister is considered quite a moderate conservative, and oh, I know, he is quite infamous for taking a lot of vacations to Costa Rica, apparently as much as several months a year, which seems a little high for a sitting premier, but he does live in Manitoba. Next door to Manitoba, we have Ontario, home of Premier Doug Ford, but since we already talked about him, let's skip one province over, which brings us to Quebec, home of Premier Philippe Couillard. Couillard is a Liberal. He was elected in 2014, unseating Quebec's previous separatist government. Okay, so every Quebec election over the last 40 or so years has been fought between the Separatist Party, which is called the Parti Québécois, and the Quebec Liberal Party. And all good Canadians, regardless of whether they're Liberal voters or Conservative voters or NDP voters, are supposed to support the Quebec Liberal Party because all good Canadians are supposed to be very opposed to the idea of Quebec leaving Canada. And so Premier Couillard was initially seen as a very heroic figure in the eyes of the Canadian establishment, as Quebec Liberal premiers always are, you know, beating down the separatist forces and a great victory for the unity of Canada and this sort of thing. And he did get some initial praise as well for sort of helping put Quebec's finances back in some semblance of order. You know, Quebec is traditionally considered a bit of a financial basket case, but Premier Couillard would proceed to squander a lot of that initial goodwill when his government passed one of these European-style burqa bans to sort of crack down on Muslim women being too visible in Quebec public life. That was seen as a real sop to Quebec xenophobia and racism, which of course does not exist. Please do not denounce me in your parliament again, Quebec. Quebec politics are actually evolving in this kind of weird, very European direction in general, which makes them quite hard for outsiders like me to fully understand. They have all these new parties that don't really have any analogy in the rest of Canada. Premier Couillard is facing a tough battle for re-election later this year, and it seems like his main opponent is not in fact the Separatist Party anymore, but rather the Coalition for Quebec Party, which is this sort of vaguely conservative nationalistic party. They actually argue that his burqa ban didn't go far enough. So that election, much like the election of Doug Ford in Ontario, might wind up being this sort of interesting case study on the power of right-wing populism in Canada as well. Alrighty, so east of Quebec, we have the 4 Atlantic Canadian provinces. These are very small places that have quite bland politics that tends to fly under the Canadian national radar. All of their governments are run by the Liberal Party and are considered quite allied with Prime Minister Trudeau, though this is usually seen as a byproduct of the fact that these places are generally quite poor and very dependent on government handouts, as opposed to because they like Trudeau's agenda on, you know, feminism or whatever. The senior statesman of these 4 amigos is Nova Scotia Premier Stephen McNeil, who was elected in 2013. One thing he is known for is being Canada's tallest premier, amusingly illustrated in this photograph of him being interviewed by my old Sun News friend Paige. The Premier of New Brunswick is Brian Gallant, who was elected in 2014. He is Canada's youngest premier and was elected at only 32. Because he is young and good looking and in tight with Trudeau, I suspect people will suggest that he has a future in federal politics. Because New Brunswick premiers all speak French, there's always a lot of hype about the political future of New Brunswick premiers. The Premier of Prince Edward Island is Wade McLaughlin. He was elected in 2015. He had a long and distinguished career as a prominent Canadian academic before he got into politics. He also made some news for being the first ever gay man to be elected Premier of a Canadian province. And then there is Dwight Ball, the Premier of Newfoundland, elected in 2015 as well. As far as I can tell, there is absolutely nothing interesting about him. I'm sorry if these biographies sound very boring and superficial, but the fact is the premiers of Canada's maritime provinces are just not very interesting people. They are mostly just career politicians who have slagged their way through the ranks of the Liberal Party to lead bland, centrist governments that are mostly interested in trying to foster economic growth in some of the most economically depressed regions of Canada. And speaking of small and poor, I guess I should say something about the governments of Canada's 3 northern territories, which is something you guys ask me about a lot. Well, they have very tiny populations, and as a result, the most obscure politics of all. In Nunavut and the Northwest Territories, their politics is so unsophisticated, in fact, that they don't even have political parties, which just makes it even harder for outsiders to engage with. The Premier of the Northwest Territories is Robert McLeod. He is Canada's oldest premier, born in 1952. He was elected in 2011. And it says on his official biography that he is the former vice president of the Fur Institute of Canada. And then there is Sandy Silver, who has been the Liberal Premier of Yukon since 2016. I guess he's sort of interesting because he's the only Canadian Premier who consciously moved to the place he now runs. Premier Silver grew up in Nova Scotia, but he moved to Yukon in his late 20s to start a new life in the exotic Canadian North. From what I understand, the Yukon relies quite heavily on people from other provinces fleeing their past lives to sustain their economy and political system? Okay, now here is an interesting thing. As I am filming this, the territory of Nunavut just elected a new premier. The Nunavut Parliament has voted no confidence in the administration of Premier Paul Quassa and replaced him with Joe Savikatak. He will now become the only non-white premier of Canada, as he is of Inuit descent, just like most Nunavut people, and indeed most Nunavut premiers. So anyway, that is all of the premiers of the Canadian provinces and territories for you. Thank you so much for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe. If I missed any important information, please let me know in the comments below, and let me know what other sort of Canadian themed videos you might like me to make in the future. Until then, catch you next week.